All right, well, hello everyone. We're going to get started now. My name is Amanda Kirk. I'm a game developer. I've been in the industry for about 8-9 years, and I transitioned to working at Rensselaer Polytechnic, which is a game development program up in upstate New York. Troy. Yes, it's in Troy. Wow. Shout out to Troy. So in my past life, I was lucky enough to work on a bunch of different platforms. I started working on Nintendo DS games. Like I worked on Club Penguin and a bunch of other like children's educational games. I then proceeded to work on some 3DS titles. And then from there, the 3DS didn't really take off in North America for third party like as much as they wanted it to. So we started working on educational games. And then from there, we went and tried to explore serious games and a couple of augmented reality titles. So I'm very lucky that I had a lot of experience designing games for a variety of different platforms. So most of the engines that our dev team used were proprietary, or they would cost a lot of money to use at the time. But as a designer, my job was really to test the gameplay systems before we would implement them in full. So I used a lot of smaller programs and got to play with a lot of different dev environments to try to, create and study and test the mechanics that we're going to have in the game before they were fully implemented. So before we can really tackle game design as a whole, we probably need to have a proper definition for a game. So there's many different opinions on this topic in the field of game design study. So many of them have elements that are correct. So I would say that my favorite definition of what is a game comes from rules of play. So a game is a system in which players engage in artificial conflict defined by rules that result in a quantifiable outcome. So I think when you're looking at anything that you're working on in game design, those are really the key pillars. There's, certainly you can agree with particular genres or whatever, but I think that is really a clear definition of what your role as a game designer is. So my role is to design the systems and its rule set and ensure that players are able to understand and navigate the system and feel rewarded for their success. So that's what my specific job is. And then as a member of a team, our role is to be able to work with the other disciplines, the programmers, the artists, the audio people, and make sure that the vision can be achieved within the guidelines of the overall project. Because obviously, if you're working on a game, you're going to be having limitations, hardware limitations, time, money, whatever. So there's a lot of different resources that can train you on design thinking. So my number one book recommendation would be The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. It's a really quick read, and it talks about how things in everyday life have design features to them, and that kind of can educate you on how to think of how real life is, has like usability elements to it. So I'm often asked what game design is from, people that aren't in game development. And they assume that all game designers have skill sets that are similar to like graphic designers or web designers, which isn't always the case. They can have those sets, but those skills, but it's not necessarily always the case. So generally, the role of a game designer on a project is to develop the ideas, specify the requirements, implement and design features, and this can be, building out a level. So if you're making a platformer game, you could be making different levels for it. You can be implementing puzzles if it's a puzzle game. Sometimes you may be, depending on the size of your team, you might be doing writing. You're gonna, after the game has some level of development, a designer is gonna perform play tests to gather data, and they're gonna make adjustments to the game based on the data that was gathered from the play tests. Obviously, in a perfect world with infinite time, all these things can be accommodated, but that's not reality. So if you're an indie or you're working in a small studio, a lot of times you'll wear many of these hats, so you'll do a lot of these different things. But the other thing, and then you may even do stuff in addition to your design tasks. So I did a lot of production work as well. At a large AAA studio, you're probably only going to do one or two things. So maybe you're a systems designer and all you worry about is the interactions of the game, or maybe you're a level designer, so the only thing you work on is the levels, etc. So that's just things to think about if you're thinking of becoming a game designer, that there are a lot of different things you can do. And then also that there's a lot of there's a lot of different definitions of what a designer can be. So first, let's run through the basic phases of game development. So first, we have to have some kernel of an idea that we're going to develop, and that's kind of done in the ideation phase. Often, at that point, you would make paper prototypes to develop so you develop the idea, and then you would make paper prototypes to refine that idea and make sure that it makes sense before you start doing something like putting it in code, which is typically more expensive. So during and after implementation, you would test the game and make sure that it's able to meet the expectations of your players. So this process can take anywhere from 24 hours if you're doing a game jam, or it can take 5 years, depending on the scope of work that you're looking at. I would say most indie devs now are looking around two-year dev cycles. That seems to be kind of the sweet spot. So you want to make a game. Do you already have a basic idea? Or is that something that you're going to develop along the way? So before you jump into something, it's really important to consider your end goals. So are you starting from an idea, or are you just wanting to make a game using a specific platform? And then once you've defined your primary goal, you can brainstorm some potential concepts that can work with your core idea. So what you're developing is the core mechanic. What is your player going to be doing 90% of the game? Because if that's not fun, then the rest of your game isn't going to have any legs. So then from there, you can kind of develop what the rest of your game is going to be. So now you're going to develop your idea. Sorry, I don't have notes on this. So you're going to list what you're going to have included in the game. This is kind of like developing a paper a game design document. You're going to list what the challenges of the project are. So you have risks. Any game has risks. Either you don't know something, or you have lots and lots of writing that have to be put in the game, something like that. You're going to have the overall goal of the game, and you're going to describe what the player will experience. So this can kind of allow you to refine what is the player going to be doing when they're playing the game, and you can talk to people about it and get feedback already. And there'll be things that you haven't really thought about in terms of usability and interaction. How is if it's a gardening game, how is the player going to actually garden? Is it going to be a mechanic where what is the play time for the game? Is it going to be a 15-minute interaction, or is it going to be a 5-minute interaction? So you're going to distill your game into its core mechanics. The goal in doing this is so that you're able to actually complete the game. A lot of times people will come up with lots of wonderful ideas, and they could be really great and exciting, but if you're not able to maintain a good scope, then you're not going to be able to, you're not going to want to finish the game, and you're not probably going to be able to complete the game. So once you've developed the core list of things that you're going to do, you're going to want to start prototyping. Often you'll start with paper prototyping. This is done with index cards and chits, graph paper, whatever it is that you're doing. So you're trying to create your game system, and you can do mock-ups, you can just do simple drawings. I've seen people do it using slide decks, PowerPoint presentations. So this way you can kind of play through what the game will be like, and you can kind of look at what the things that are risky, if they're mechanics, and you can test those out and kind of refine that before you've really gotten ready to make the actual game itself. So I guess the one question I get a lot is why use open source software? In this case, why would you choose open source versus there's a lot of other products out there that cost money or are free? So what I really think is important about considering open source software is that you can use it with closed source software. You can use it in combination with other things. Open source is terrific because it's free. It's accessible to anyone. And there's communities that are built around these open source products. So what that means is that if you are a really good programmer and you're really excited about working in Godot or working in some other software platform, you can improve, like if there's something that's bothering you, you can go and fix it. And if you're getting started in some of the environments, like the id tech things, there are huge communities that have already built up things for you, and you can leverage that. So you're not starting from scratch. And a lot of times you don't have a paywall. If you have a question, it's just very accessible to get into it. So what I wanted to do now is kind of talk about the different platforms that are available. At this, you've considered, like in the narrative of this talk, you've kind of figured out what kind of game you're going to make. And depending on those goals, you'll want to consider what platform you want to use or what tools you need. So these are a bunch of open source game dev platforms and art tools that you can use. So there's a lot of open source game dev tools out there. I'm going to go over a few, but you should be mindful that there's lots of options out there, and there's no right answer either. You need to use what's going to work for your skill set and what's going to work for your project. So I was going to start by talking about Lua, which is kind of a bit of an outlier because it's a scripting system, which is open source. It's really great because you can use this in a lot of different environments, and it can really extend the flexibility of a code base. When I have used it in the past, it typically has been on on projects where the code base was using our proprietary system, and then we would use Lua for the designers, such as myself, so that we could then add content in without having to bother our engineers. So I was able to do things like do mission scripting. So it was a point-click adventure that we were developing, and you would be able to, as a designer, we would be able to define, when there was a specific line of dialogue, when you obtained an item, that kind of thing. So what you would expect in a point-click adventure. We've also used it to script battle mechanics. So if you're having like wave-based fighting games or shooter games, you could specify which fighters or whatever would appear at that specific time, and like if there was low health. And these are all things that I would work with an engineer to define, like this is what we need the system to do, and they could develop this, and then we could just work within that framework, and I wouldn't have to go and compile my code all the time because it's smaller, so you can work and compile at the data level. We also use it for UI transitions. So we could use Lua and it's like a very simple, like script language. So it's like even simpler than Python, I would say. So you could have it where you had a UI transition, instead of bothering an artist or a programmer to like make like a nice, fade in, like slide in effect. That's something that I could tune, and I could spend like a day looking at all our UI menus and making them 10% juicier because I could do that without having to bug someone else. So that kind of highlights how Lua can be used with an existing system. And so in these ideas, of course, I'm in a group. So what is really exciting is that there are tools that utilize Lua as their scripting language. So there is, let's see, yeah. So we have Love, which is it's an open source 2D kind of action-oriented scripting system. And the thing that I really like about Love is that they have a really cute tutorial, and they allow you to, there's like a really good community that has a whole list of things that they've developed. So there's like a narrative system already built into Love because someone did that and shared it, and it got put onto this huge list of different things you can do. And it really allows you to play with Love in a way where you can learn how to use Lua, and then immediately see like a net result. There's also Corona, which is a mobile-based. So I'd say Love is more PC-based, where Corona is more of a mobile development platform. I haven't played around with that too much, but you can make mobile games in Lua and put them out there. I also wanted to talk about some other 2D engines. A lot of them are Python-based because it's open source. Phaser is really popular, and it's really awesome. There's a lot of tutorials out there on how to make, like 2D platforming puzzle games. It uses Python, which is a very popular, awesome language. Pygame is another one. It's much simpler than a lot of languages because it's been around for a long time. But I think if you really want to learn Python, it's a really good option. And then if you're making a narrative game, you probably don't want to use any of those engines, right? So there are narrative open source things. Twine is open source. That is really simple to use and understand. You can just pop into it and start creating nodes. A lot of times when people are making larger narrative games and they're prototyping, they'll use Twine to start out. Like they'll make everything in Twine first and then implement it in whatever engine they're using. I think Twine also now integrates with Unity. So if you want to use Unity, you can kind of combine the two. RenPy is the other one. It's Python based and it's amazing. I've used it very frequently when we have high school students come in and we would take them on as internship, like mini internships, or we do like a week-long game camp and we use that. A question? It is REN hyphen like apostrophe and then PY. So it's a visual novel engine, and it's great because sorry. So what is Python in a traditional language? I don't know enough about. So with RenPy, which is Python based, you can make a narrative like a visual novel, so you can have characters with backgrounds and scripting and stories, which allow, and especially for like people who are more art focused or narrative focused, it can really quickly get you something that you can play. Because it is Python based, you are able to like kind of hook into other things. So there's like RPGs that have turn-based battle systems in there. And then I was going to talk about Godot, which is an open source 2D and 3D engine. It's kind of like open source Unity. It uses Godot script. So there's a couple of different scripting languages you can use in Godot. You can use a visual scripting language, Godot, which is a Python derivative. Like their proprietary language, but it's open source, so it's not technically proprietary, I guess. And then they also, I think they can do C# now, so you can go in, and if you know C#, you can use that. So what is really great about it is it, like a lot of modern dev tools, it has examples, so you can go and play a platformer already. They also have like the ability to do 2D or 3D games, so it's a really nice way to kind of transition from one to the other. I also wanted to talk about like 3D engines, because I think that's something that isn't often talked about when we talk about open source game engines. I think they're more few and far between because it's much simpler to set up. It's much easier to make a 2D game. So if you're making your first game, I would definitely recommend staying in 2D. If you are looking at doing 3D and you're like really into engineering already and you have a lot of programming background, these are mostly C-based. Then you can use these. So Torque and Ogre are both independently developed engines. So you'd require CMake to compile them. So if you're like really into programming, this is simple. This is obvious to you. If you've never programmed before, it's a little bit more complicated. Ogre has been used to make Torchlight 2, and it's a little bit quicker to set up, in my opinion, than Torque. But it does require a little bit more effort. There's also idTech, which is the Quake engine, the Doom engine. Those are all open source. And they are, I find that it's really challenging to go to the actual Git for idTech and start from there. I would use find a community that's making something you like, or be part of a community to start before you really start working in that. And then you could kind of, see how those engines work. So then I wanted to talk about art, because obviously if you don't have any visuals in your game, you're not going to be, there's nothing to see. Typically you would, if you're working in a regular game studio, you're probably working with Adobe products. For 3D, you're typically working with like Autodesk. For 2D art, there's a bunch of different 2D art platforms that you can use. There's the GIMP, which because I know Photoshop, I find it's harder to transition from Photoshop to GIMP. But so I use Krita instead, which is, again, it's open source. It's very painterly, so it's probably more similar to like Clip Art Studio or something like that. But it is open source. It supports layers. I find it's very easy to naturally get in there. And I think that's the point, is that if you're trying to figure out what works, like look at a bunch of options and then figure out if that has the feature that you're looking for. Inkscape is a vector-based open source paint program. So if you're looking for vector art, you can use that. Personally, I use SketchUp because it's like $100 and it has a lot of community support. But if you're looking to be exclusively open source, that's something to check out, and it's free, so why not? The other thing is, if you're lazy or not artistically inclined, you can look at opengameart.org. That is a repository full of 2D art objects. They have textures. They have like sprite art if you're making like an RPG or something like that. And it's all open source and free. And if you're an artist and you want to be helpful and put art up there, you can do that too. The other thing I wanted to talk about was Blender, which is really the only 3D modeling program that I really know about. It is open source, and there's a lot of tutorials out there that can easily get you modeling, rigging, texturing. There's things that plug in with it that you can use. It has, some people I know, instead of using Premiere, which is an Adobe product, they can make videos using Blender. Like they can do video editing using Blender. So it's really great, and it's really easy and quick to get started. If you want to try 3D modeling, that's definitely an option. All right. And then I think I'm going too quickly, but I wanted to talk about game jams, because I think that once you kind of have an idea that you want to make a game, or that you want to learn a specific program, a lot of times you kind of can get stuck not knowing how to get started, or not having like an important date in mind or some sort of reason to start working. And I think game jams is really a good thing to look at in terms of like being able to learn and being able to explore different game platforms. So what's really good is that at a game jam, you're able to create a game under constraints, such as a limited period of time or a theme. So if you have, you just want to get something hammered out and see if a specific mechanic works, you can do that. Or if you have like writer's block, you can't figure out what you want to make a game about, well, you have a specific theme that you're working towards. So it's a really good place, and it's also a really good place to meet other developers, and you can kind of get your feet wet because you're all working together on a team, and you don't really have a lot of vested interest in taking this game beyond the 24 or 48 hour. They have some week-long jams. So this is a list from itch.io. They list a whole bunch of game jams that occur like all the time. Some of them can be 2 days, some of them can be 2 weeks or a month. So if you're looking at just trying to pick a jam, that's one way to go. The reason why I like doing these is so that you can, you're kind of constrained. You're kind of required to do teamwork, because most of the time you would want to work in a team. They require planning. So if you only have a limited time, you're going to have to figure out what can get in that limited time. They cure perfectionism, which is a huge issue in getting people started making games, because it's not going to be a perfect game. So you're not going to be, working at it for a long time. They provide feedback. So a lot of times you're doing this in a group or you're posting it online. And they also offer kind of a friendly competition. Sometimes they have rewards. Sometimes It's just kind of camaraderie. So I wanted to show, these are a list of games that were done at game jams. A lot of them are popular, or, you know, we can call them successful, if they are. I think most of them are. So it's really cool because this way, like, the one on the far right is Gods Will Be Watching, which is a very small independent developer, and they keep doing game jams. So, and when they do a game jam game, they release them for free, because a lot of times game jams are also considered to be open source. Can we do questions at the end? Is that okay?
There is a game jam at this time.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention that while
That's my next slide, actually. So my next slide is, there are game jams that are happening in the future. So if you're not ready to commit today or this weekend, Global Game Jam is January 25th through 27th. And that is something that happens around the world. So it doesn't matter where you've traveled from. You can go to their website. You can type in your location, but you'll find that. There's also Love Them Dare, which is a very large jam that is mostly remote. Sometimes they do have them. And then you can also check your local indie dev scene, or, you know, whatever, and they have jams there. The other thing, which I was unfortunate when I was prepping my slides, the schedule wasn't ready yet, but there are game jams that you can do here. There's a PBS jam. Do you know the other jams?
I just know there's a tabletop game jam on Saturday.
Yeah, so there are, and I think if you can look in you can participate in the guidebook. And you can go in there, and they have a bunch of different, they have red dots on them. If you sort, yeah. So they have a bunch of workshops that you can go and do a game jam today or this weekend. They'll have, I think most of them have like a panel begin to kick them off that explains how it works, and then you can go and do that. So cool. And that's all I have. If you have any additional questions, I saw lots of hands. Do we want to, how do we want to do this? No one told me how to manage questions at this event. Yes. So I don't know any good Java-based engines. There's HTML5 engines, which are JavaScript, which is entirely different. I don't know if they really support open source engines. Baldi's Basics? No, I mean, I don't know that game. I believe you. I'm sorry. I don't know all games. Is there? Yes. So I worked on the Club Penguin DS game, the second one, Herbert's Revenge. So we got to work with the team that developed the online game. So Club Penguin 1, which was before my time, we had written a whole script and story for that. Club Penguin 2 was, I think they were changing how the whole narrative worked. So it was kind of like WoW had Cataclysm, Club Penguin had something else. And so Club Penguin 2, Herbert's Revenge, was you started so there was it was framed. So the first chapter was that Herbert was going to get revenge, and then the rest of the game was taking the online game and converting it into DS. And I think we added more, is it Puffles? The little fluffy things? I don't know. But we added more of those mechanics, and we had we had different mini games because it's a different system, so you can't really design that. Is there a specific Penguin related question you had? Okay. Yes.
See, I'm a little familiar with that because I've never played those games, so unfortunately they're both about it. But so you mentioned that there was looking onto different systems and making this work together to work with certain stuff in your spare time. Was that used on working on this single game, getting narratives on the side?
No, actually, Club Penguin was a very large project for our team. So everyone was dragged into it. Everyone was allowed the great opportunity to work on this thing. So I did the tutorial design for Club Penguin 2. When I joined the project, most of the stuff had already been sussed out, but I was part of some of like the pre-planning, like, so that's why I knew how the narrative worked and how that functioned. But most of my involvement in that was creating a giant spreadsheet of all of the mechanics in the game and min-maxing it so that players, when they're playing it, wouldn't feel like we didn't have enough map levels, or when the players are learning how to use a specific puffle, then they would making sure that they would be able to practice and use it then, and that later on the puffle wouldn't get lost. Like, why are we going to have I think that's 6 puffles. I really don't remember. But like, if you're going to have that many puffles, you got to make sure that they're all getting enough love, because otherwise, like, what's the point? Or the worst case scenario is if you teach them at the beginning of the game and then it's like going to progression block you at the end, but you forget what the puffle does. Like, that's a failure point. So you want people who've never played Club Penguin before, or the first game, to be able to like get in there. And then the other challenge, of course, a lot of times, so then I also did scripting. So like, when you're climbing up there's like a big cave you're trying to climb up, and there's like this part where you can either go right or go left. I don't know, but it was a huge team. It was pretty sweet. Yeah, I mean, it was a yeah. 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 Sure.
Creating artwork or something of that nature with an open source tool, the artwork is the only thing you're creating, and you expect people to see it. When you're creating an executable, you're frequently linking in code that was part of the open source product. Does that oblige you to provide open source access to your code as well?
It depends on the license. I think it depends on what the licensing is for the product. A lot of times you just have to stipulate that that's what you're using. Definitely in Lua, like there's no issue. Those were proprietary engines, and there's no one has any control over that. Or are you asking me, if you're using it, shouldn't you be contributing?
No, more the question you were just speaking to. I know, for example, there's lots of GPL code out there that if you link to that and it becomes part of your executable, GPL will allow you to release your product in GPL as well.
Yes. Yes. Right. So exactly. So you want to be able to make the determination in the beginning that, the products that you're using are going to allow you to make it something that you can sell, or something that you don't have to release for free. A lot of times the Game Jam games, like Global Game Jam, to participate in Global Game Jam, you need to accept that it's open source. So you're releasing your source code when you do your Global Game Jam. So that's why most people who work on Global Game Jams, even after they've shipped titles, will allow those to be open for free, because it is free. You could compile it, and that's how it would work. So in those cases, I mean, you'd have to talk to a lawyer. There are lawyer panels, but effectively, when they're going to develop a game based on that, it's assuming some sort of licensing that doesn't require you to release it for free. So, you were first. Especially remote teams, that's hard. So do you know, like, if you knew everyone if you know people, then if you already know people, then I think that's fairly easy, because you already know what you can do. And then you can look at using different production tools to kind of like Trello, to try to like have some sort of organization. So you would need someone who's actually good at leading teams to help coordinate everybody, because you're in like Skype calls and that kind of thing. Yes.
To an open source engine, but you still have a proprietary team that fits into it. So
Thank you. Yep. Yeah, I mean, it depends on your local area because it'll definitely impact what kind of groups are there. We have, in our space, we have the IGDA, which is the International Game Developers Association, and they have monthly meetings. We do a mixer, so you can just go and hang out with your dev friends, and it's open to anybody. There's also game spaces that have been opening up. We have one in our area called the Tech Valley Game Space. So they kind of work with the community and do a lot of like training. In New York City, there's a lot of like there's a Unity dev group. There's Playcrafting, which is similar, like a game space, so people work together. So it really depends on your area, and you can definitely look online for those kind of organizations. And a lot of times they intermingle, so you might meet one, and then you'll kind of explore where to go from there. Yep.
Actually, I found a couple local groups on meetup.com.
Yeah, Meetup is good too. Yep.
That are in one of the Virginia and Fairfax area.
When developing your first game, what would you say the biggest obstacle was?
Scope creep, probably. Or being nervous that you're going to make something that's ugly, and you're going to make something that's ugly. You just have to get over that. And scope creep is when you just keep adding more and more things to it and you don't define when it's done. So the best thing to do is to think of what your dream idea is and then parse it into like a little tiny mini idea and then work on that. There's a question over there. Yep.
As an independent developer, how do you get a wide base of systems for testing your games so that you know that it'll work on different systems?
That's a good question. So I don't know because that's not something that I've had to really explore a lot. Most of the games that we worked on were I guess mobile would be the one example that we would work on, and we were a very small developer, so we had like a bunch of like old, like the graveyard of phones that we would then test on. A lot of times we would have to make hardware purchases. I think if you know people in your area that are doing development, probably you could pool resources and see who has what phone. I know that the game space in our area is trying to get a library of hardware to do testing. There's also overseas, you can hire people who will do that, but then that's like a whole different scope. Like I have no idea how much that would cost. Yep. Yep. It would depend on what kind of game you're developing and who you want to see your game. I think that's another thing to keep in mind is if you're developing a game for like who is your target audience for the game, right? And then if you're looking for, or what kind of feedback are you looking for? Like, are you trying to see if your friends like the game, or are you trying to see if someone within, like, is it just for your friends? And then you can give it to your friends, they can play it. But if you're looking for games for kids or games for, like, I'm a game designer, so I'm not a very good test case for, is my game fun? Because I don't fit in a regular, like, target demo. So I would go and try to find people and get people excited about what I was making. Probably that's what I would do, is I would, like, show what the game is beyond like friends and family. Like you would show your friends, you'd family, get feedback and whatever thoughts. If you're in part of a game dev community, you can get a lot of feedback that way. And then once you got big enough, then you would probably be marketing the game already. You should be marketing your game fairly early these days because, and by marketing, I just mean having some sort of social media presence. And then you can start getting a mailing list together, and then you could put people on like a beta list. You can also put it on Itch, which is a free platform that allows you to upload anything, and you can get feedback that way too. Oh, you had a question? Oh, questions? Yes.
It's funny that you mentioned that because you mentioned scope creep, but I'm wondering if there's like a sort of combination. Like, at what point do you, like, at what point are you, like, trying to accommodate too many people? Like, at what point should you try to rein in, like, how many audiences that you're trying to tackle?
You should do that at the beginning, before you've made anything. You need to know, like, what are you making and who is it for? Because who is it for is probably your most important question to keep in mind, because you're going to get so much feedback, and you as a designer need to be able to apply the filter to whether or not it's something that you can actually implement. It doesn't matter if they want something crazy town, because you can't put it in the game. If it doesn't fit within, so you have to know who your tester is. If it's your buddy and you're making a game about science and he hates science, then the feedback that you care about is, can he learn how to play the game in a way that's effective? You don't really care about his opinion on if the science is fun. You're going to go find people who are science nerds. They're going to play it, and you're going to get feedback there. So I think that's the thing too, is, playtesting is really important, and it can be really challenging to find good playtesters. But even a little bit of playtesting, even if you're slightly out of the demo, is more important than no playtesting at all. And I wouldn't imagine adding things when you're not going to add a feature after a playtest. You're going to refine a feature, or you're going to cut a feature. Mm.
I find something that a lot of like games struggle with, and I struggle with it personally, because I like what I'm playing to like make me think critically, have like fun with the edge. Like, it's okay if I lose, as long as I win eventually, if I take the truck. But I know that varies from person to person, and it kind of like goes back to the, as a game designer, I don't know what's too hard to complete. Like, at what point is it that you're overdoing to try to accommodate certain people, and you should kind of when you're not trying to complete.
Yeah, so that is definitely something that you would get through playtesting, because you're not going to be able to playtest your game. Like, for difficulty, you're not. It's not possible, because you're going to know how everything works. When we do game design for kids, that is also really challenging. You have to assume, which is painful, that if they're 8 or under, they can't read. So everything has to be kind of show, not tell. And a lot of games for kids these days are developed in a way where they can progress through the game without failing. Like, a lot of test games that we've tested, and a lot of games that we've developed, it's easy to get a bronze. You can complete the game, but as you get older, you're smarter and you're more goal oriented. Like, because if you're 4 to 6, you don't really care about beating the game. You're playing effectively. So those kids don't need a lot of scores. They don't care about scores. When they get older, they start caring about scores. So that's how the difficulty is implemented that way. I think in a modern AAA game, they now have difficulty settings, right? So if I'm just there for the story and I don't want to learn whatever mechanic, I can go and switch it to easy mode and get through. Or if I really want to perfect the game, because I'm really all I do is play action, action games. So I'm really good at them. I'm not going to play it on easy mode because it's like a joke. So I'm going to go play it on a medium or hard setting. So that's one thing you could do. Or you can have it. I think the challenge is, in this day and age, it's hard to have a game that is too hard unless you're specifically making a game that is very hard. I play a lot of Crusader Kings 2, which has no onboarding whatsoever. And that was their goal. Their goal was to make a game where you would have to go into the community and read guides and learn stuff. And that was very effective at the time. And now they're moving away from that, and they're trying to make the game, because the UI is not accessible at all. And there's really not a good reason for that. It doesn't matter if your game is hard. If your game is unreadable, so they're trying to fix those things, because now they're big enough and they're trying to enlarge their pie because they want more users. So now they're putting a lot more interest and excitement into making sure that their UIs are actually going to work.
Still fun and interesting, and don't go down
That's hard. I mean, it's really hard, but it would be play testing. It's hard to try to work, like, you can't worry about that, I would say. Like, as a designer at that point, if there's something that's really terrible and really doesn't like work with the community, then you'll have to like decide what you're going to do. But I think that's where a lot of times people have problems with, because like you can put it in and then it doesn't get used, or everyone hates it. It's like, how do you know that in advance before it's out? You know, so it's really kind of, because you have a holistic idea of how the game is supposed to be. And I think from a game design perspective, when you're looking at it that way, you can you already know what's going to be risky. And if it's something that you think someone won't like, then you should be working on that like first and then testing it and seeing if it works out. And that's kind of more in a prototype stage than in the full development stage, I would say. Anyone else? Yes.
So, we look at a product and say, like, when this product is not the best, and you should scrap this game entirely.
Yeah, there is. There is. And I mean, that's why you have studios shut down sometimes, right? Because they've been working on a game so long and it doesn't work. MMOs have huge issues with that, where they work on something or what was it? What's the epic one that just shut down? Is it Paragon? Was that the name of it? Right? They like spent all this dev time and it turned out games are hard. Games are hard. I don't know if I mentioned that, but game development is really challenging and hard because you're trying to make something creative in a really complex ecosystem, and there's a lot of other games out there. So at some point, someone who is in a business position, right? If you're thinking of it from a business perspective, then you can look at it and be like, no, this is not going to work. I think from like an indie perspective, I think it's a bit harder to make that decision that you're going to stop working on your passion project because people aren't going to like it. I think a lot of times they end up just getting iced, right? Like, oh, we'll put it on hold, and then it's on indefinite hold and never comes back. So I guess the question is it better to just put the game out even if it's shot? Like what is your goal? Like if your goal is to make money and have a good brand, then yeah, you're probably going to cut your project, right? But if it's your project and you're trying to like show that you can do something, then you probably are going to put it out because like, is it just going to live in a box? And a lot of times that's why game jams are really good, because you're just making, you know, small games over a short period of time. And that way you can kind of iterate and learn what works and what doesn't work before you go and make decisions about cutting games. It's sad. Yeah. I mean, then we're getting into like indie apocalypse kind of discussion, I guess. But it depends on your purpose. Like if you're trying to create a portfolio, I think it's really useful. If you're trying to sell a game that isn't going to be marketable, then you're really just wasting your time, I would imagine. At a game jam, no, because it's too short. I think a lot of times what is missing in our local area for game jams is always artists. So we end up with really ugly looking games. But it really depends on what your community is and how you gather people into your community. Sure.
You mentioned one of the potential advantages of an open source tool is that theoretically you can modify it. As a practical matter in your shop, is that correct? Yeah.
It has happened because we were working on, we were looking at I mean, theoretically, it could happen, I guess. So there is a open source AR kit called Eris, which lets you do like geolocation for like augmented reality games. So you could go on like a treasure hunt, and that was released, I think, only as an iOS app, but there is an Android app that was. So some people had developed over on the left, they had developed it for Android, and we had pulled that in. We were starting to work on that, but then the project fell through, so it didn't work out. I think a lot of times it's really more indie developers that are busy working on like improving it. And I think the thing that's good about that is then if that's something that you're interested in, then you can develop a name for yourself, right? By updating things and becoming a part of like a global community up doing things like that. I don't know if it's really practical because it's not something that I've done. Cool. I think we're out of questions. Well, thank you.